Hey Code Crew, in this lesson we're going to do a real example of using core data inside Xcode. I'll go through two different scenarios. Number one, how to start your Xcode project with core data enabled. And number two, how to add core data functionality to an existing Xcode project. Now, even if you're only interested in number two, I would still highly recommend that you watch through part one, because in part one, I'm going to be highlighting the different core data components that are needed. Now, just a quick recap of the previous lesson in case you didn't see it. To work with core data, we need four things. Number one is to define our entities and attributes in the core data model. Number two is to generate the classes from the core data model. Number three, get a reference to the core data persistent container. And then number four, get the managed object context through which we save and retrieve our objects. All right, let's jump into Xcode and do this. All right, first we're going to talk about setting up core data with a brand new Xcode project, and then afterwards we're going to talk about how to add core data to an existing Xcode project. So here I'm going to set up a brand new Xcode project here, and I'm going to choose single view application, and all you need to do to set up core data is to make sure this checkbox is enabled. So let's call this our core data demo, and just make sure that's enabled. And let's hit next. Oh, by the way, I am still using Storyboard's UI kit here. So if you're following this demo, you can select the same thing. Let's click next, and I'm going to save this on my desktop. Now, the first thing you'll notice is that enabling that use core data option gave you this file along with your new project, this XC data model file. And when you click that, you get this visual editor to define your entities and attributes. If you remember from the slide we just saw, the first step is to define our entities and attributes. So let's go ahead and do that through this visual interface. Down here, click Add Entity, and you're going to see your new entity here. Now you can either edit the name by clicking it once, so you make it editable, or you can come in here and just change the name of the entity. So I'm going to use the same example as we did in lesson 1 of this core data series, which is to use the person and family analogy. We're only going to start with person for now. Later, when we talk about relationships in core data, then we're going to define our family entity as well. All right, so before we move on to attributes, there are a couple of things I want to point out in terms of the attributes for the entity. Number one is the name, which we've just defined. Number two is this module or namespace. If you have an Xcode project which houses multiple modules or Xcode or other projects, then you can define which namespace you want this entity to be a part of. By default, it's global. So I think for most of us who are just creating an Xcode project for a single app that has one module, you don't have to worry about this. But just in case your project has multiple modules and you don't want this person class name to clash with some other person class name in another module, then you can definitely define the namespace here, or rather which namespace this person is part of. The next part is code gen. Now, after we define our entities and attributes, when we generate the classes, you can actually do that either manually or have Xcode do that for you when you build and run the app. By default, Xcode will do it for you automatically. But for now, I want you to change this option to manual none, because I want to show you how to do it manually. And then I will also tell you about the other two options, because there are trade-offs to be made. So let's go ahead and select manual none for now. All right, now we're ready to add our attributes. So under here, you can click this plus symbol to add a new attribute, or you can click this add attribute icon down here, which I think is not as intuitive as this guy. So go ahead and click add item, and then you can give it a name. So our first one was just name. So let's just name it that. And then the type, let's choose string. So we're going to add another one. We had gender here, and again, this was a string. Now the next one was age, and the type was actually an int. Now you'll see in the type here, there's integer 16, 32, and 64. If you're not familiar with what those are, basically they define the size of the integer. Now I'm going to pull up a web page here that shows you the differences with the different integer types. So you'll notice that there's different types of ints. There's 8, 32, 64, and you can see that the ranges go up as this number goes up. And there's also a uint version of each of these sizes. U stands for unsigned, which means that there's no negative range. So as you can see, int 64 gives you the largest range, but we don't usually have to select which type of int we use, right? When you define in Swift a new variable of the int type, you don't have to specify any of these. Well, under the hood, that int type that you specified is one of these types, and it really depends on what platform your code is running on, because different CPU architectures store data differently. Some are 32-bit, some are 64-bit, and some, as you can see, might be 8 or 16. There's this website here that I found specifying the different architectures of the iOS platforms, and you can see in here sort of what CPU architecture it's using and whether it's 32-bit or not. And as you can see, as we scroll down this list, these are the older iPhones and iPods and iPads, and as you scroll down to the newer ones, at this point, you know, in 2015, it looks like, everything starts to be 64-bit. So as you can see here, down to, you know, the latest ones down here, it's all 64-bit. So it's safe to say when you're declaring a Swift int and your app is going to be running on one of the newer devices, 2015 and above, that it's going to be 64-bit architecture. So your int is actually an int 64 with this range. So going back to the core data now, what should you specify here? Well, don't get the wrong idea. Just because for the age you won't need such a big range, thinking specifying int 16 might save you some memory or save you some space, it doesn't work like that. The memory allocated for that age variable will still be 64-bit. So you might as well just choose 64-bit. So that's kind of a long explanation about those, about what those differences are. Now you might also notice on this list that we don't have array types or you know, object types or anything like that. Well, if you wanted to specify, let's say, an array of, let's say for name, for example, and we wanted to specify an array of names instead, you choose transformable. And then over here on the right hand side, for the name attribute, you can set a custom class, and we can set this to be a type of string array. Or if it's maybe referencing another custom class that you have, you can put the class name there. And when this entity gets generated, this name attribute will be transformed into a name property of that type. So I'm just going to set it back to string for now. So if you want to learn more about configuring entities, there is Apple documentation for that, talking about the different attributes and the different things you can specify. I'll link this page in the description below the video. Now I want to talk about generating code from this entity, generating the classes, I mean. Now earlier I mentioned that there are a couple ways to do it: manual, class definition, and category extension. Let's start by manually generating this. So go ahead to editor, click create NS managed object subclass, make sure that there's a checkmark beside your data model and a checkmark beside your entity, click next, and you can just save it anywhere. It's going to create two files here, and typically what I'll do is create a model group and move that in there so things are a little more organized. So you'll notice that there are two files for your one entity, and it's person plus core data class and person plus core data properties. Let's start with this one. Now this one is the class declaration for person or your entity, you know, and it's subclassing NS managed object, which I told you before that your entity or your class needs to do in order to be saved and retrieved and basically work with core data. Now this second file is an extension of your class. So if that's new to you, just think of these two files combined together is your complete person class. This extension contains all of your attributes as properties, and you can see the data types are exactly what we specified. Notice that there's also this type method here called fetch request. So later on, we're going to be able to generate a query or a fetch request simply by typing person, the class name, dot fetch request, but we'll get into that part later. For now, the key thing I want to mention is why this is split into two classes. The reason is because for this class definition or declaration here, this is where you want to put all of your custom code. If there are custom methods you want to put into this class, this is where you would do it. This one, I would try not to modify, because when you regenerate these classes, maybe you've made a change to your model and you regenerate these classes, whatever changes you've done here are going to be overwritten. So speaking of which, whenever you make a change to any of the attribute names or the types, or maybe you add a new attribute or something like that, you're going to want to regenerate those classes. So then you can go ahead and delete your classes. If you've made changes here, definitely don't delete this file, only delete this one right here, right? Because this is the one that just defines all of your properties. But this is what manually generating your classes entails. You're going to have to manually make sure that this extension, this property extension here, is up to date with what you've defined here. Now let's talk about having Xcode automatically generate these classes for you. So if we click on the entity and we go under code gen, by default, if you remember earlier, by default it was set to class definition. When it's set to this, you don't have to manually generate the classes. So you wouldn't have these. You would basically delete these. You wouldn't have done this. What happens instead is that when you build your Xcode project, those two files right there, they automatically get generated for you behind the scenes. You'll never see them. That means you cannot edit them. So a drawback with having Xcode automatically do this for you is that if you wanted to put some like custom logic or custom methods in your person class, you can't, because you won't have these two files to modify. But the advantage is that you don't have to manually make sure that this file is up to date with whatever you've defined here, because every time you build your Xcode project, those two classes will get regenerated behind the scenes. So what we've done here is we've manually generated these, and I have the entity set to automatically generate it on build. What's going to happen if I build the project now? Well, I'm going to get an error, because what's happening is when I hit build on Xcode, it's trying to generate those two files for the entity because I've set it to that, but it also recognizes that I have these two files here in my project, so it's clashing. If you look at the error, it's going to say, multiple commands produce that file. So this is what you don't want. In order to fix a problem like this, you can simply go ahead and delete these, move these to the trash. If you want to ultimately have Xcode automatically generate them for you, you move these two files to trash, go to product, and then clean build folder to make sure you remove any artifacts, and then you can rebuild your project. Or if you want to manually do it, just set this to manual none. But you cannot have a combination of having Xcode automatically generate it for you and have these existing in your Xcode project. All right, so now for the last code gen option, which is category extension. When you have it set to this, Xcode is only going to generate this extension file for you automatically, which means you can go ahead and delete this. Now this is sort of like a happy medium. You can just straight up move it to the trash. This is a happy medium because you still get this one file, which you have to manually generate initially, and then you go ahead and delete that category extension file. But now you can add your custom logic and your custom methods, and you don't have to make sure that the extension containing all of the properties is up to date with the model, because having it set to category extension for the code gen, every time you build your Xcode project, it's going to generate that half of the class for you. And right now I have an error, probably because I didn't build my clean my build folder. As you can see, it's still complaining multiple commands produce. So I'm going to go back to product, clean build folder, and I know that having this code gen set to category extension and having this other half here, if I press Command B, I'm going to get the full definition of my entity. So I guess to sum it up, manual is full control, right? You have to generate 2 files, but you have to just make sure that it's like congruent with what you've defined here. Class definition is no control. You don't get to add, you don't get to modify the classes at all. It gets generated behind the scenes when you build the Xcode project. And category extension is it automatically generates half of it for you, and the other half you can customize the code. Okay, so now we've defined our entities and attributes. We've generated the classes. Now we need a reference to the core data persistent store. Well, when you created this Xcode project and you enabled use core data, in the app delegate, it's actually set up something additional for you down here. You can see that now we have this persistent container property. And this lazy keyword just means that it's not going to run all this code and create that container until you access it for the first time. But this is your core data persistent container, and it's a property in your app delegate. So that's how you're going to access this persistent container. As you can see here, this name here maps to this core data, this data model file right here. All right, so because this property is in the app delegate, we can access it from any view controller or any other class in our entire project. All right, now let's go into the view controller and let me show you how to access the persistent container from there. So we need a reference to the persistent container. You can access the app delegate first by typing UI application. I don't know about this one, but this is how I would normally do it. UI application.shared.delegate. And you can see that it's optional here, but the type is UI application delegate, but we got to cast it as our app delegate. Right? And then now that it's our app delegate, you can access the persistent container property. Right? So this gives us access to that core data persistent container. But if you remember from lesson 1, we don't interact with the core data persistent container directly. We use the managed object context. And in order to get a reference to that so that we can use the managed object context, we just have to access a property on the persistent container called a view context. You can see the data type for this is NS managed object context. So this is actually what we need in order to store our data, retrieve our data from core data, and all of that. But don't worry, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, because in the next lesson, we're going to look at creating, retrieving, updating, and deleting data through the managed object context. For now, I just wanted to show you how we can access the persistent container and also the managed object context. Now, before we go into adding core data to an existing project, I just want to show you one more thing in app delegate, because aside from this persistent container property, there was also another thing down here called, it also added this save context method. And as you can see, all this method is helping you do is it's getting a reference to the managed object context and then detecting if there has been any changes to the data and then saving, right? So it's just an easy way for you to save changes to your persistent container. So you can do it by simply calling the save context method of the app delegate. Okay, so when you start a new Xcode project and you enable core data right off the bat, you get the core data model file included, and in the app delegate, you have methods to access the core data persistent container and managed object context. Now, if you have an existing Xcode project that you want to convert to using core data, you won't have these things currently in your Xcode project. Now let me show you how to add them so that you can use core data. All right, so now let's say you have an existing project that you didn't set up with core data. So I'm just gonna create a test project here, and I'm not gonna enable use core data. Let's create that there. And so let's say this is your existing project. Well, all you have to do, number one, is add that data model file. So go ahead and add a new file. And under core data, choose data model, right? And you can save this with whatever your name of your project is. So I guess I'll call this testproject.xc data model. And here, you have your entities. You're going to define your entities and attributes as normal. Also, in app delegate, you'll notice that you do not have that persistent container property that I showed you, and we don't have that save context method as well. So you would just essentially add that code here, but I don't really know that code by heart, and I don't expect many people will. So what I usually do is I create a brand new Xcode project with core data enabled just to get that code, and I'll copy and paste it in here. So I can take that demo that we were just working on, and I can copy this, right? That's the persistent container property, but you have to make sure that this name right here matches that, right? So test project, and that's the core data data model file that you added. And you also have to import core data at the top, because otherwise the classes wouldn't be recognized, right? And then you can go back to your other project and just copy the saved context code over as well. And it's as simple as that. Now the other thing is, in an existing project, you probably have your own model files already, or your own model classes, I mean. You would have to redefine them as entities here, along with their attributes and all of the relationships, which a couple lessons later we'll talk about. But you'd have to redefine all of those things and then regenerate the classes to replace your current model classes. And then you would also have to alter the way that you get the data. And in the next lesson, you'll learn how to create, retrieve, update, and delete data from core data. So you're going to have to modify your existing project a little bit so that it uses that managed object context to fetch the data, save the data, and all of that stuff. All right, so in this lesson, you learned how to set up your Xcode project to use core data. Now I want to turn it over to you. Have you used any other database solution before aside from core data? Let me know by leaving a quick comment below. And lastly, if you learned something new in this video, please give it a thumbs up. It's going to help YouTube give this video more exposure, and I highly appreciate it, so thank you so much. In the next lesson, you'll learn how to create, retrieve, update, and delete data from core data. So I'll see you there. Number 3 is get a reference to our core data persistence container. Oh, let me try that last sentence again. No, what the hell? Oh man, is this dying on me? Let me see. Oh, damn it. Okay.